My name is Keith Muir, and I'm a hobbyist woodworker, and this is my little wood shop. Behind me is my lathe, and I'm going to use it today to show you how working small projects on it is a great introduction into woodworking. We'll begin by making a simple keychain. Before I get started with the keychain kit, I thought it'd be a good idea to give you a quick rundown on the tools and supplies we're going to need. And these are just basic items you would need in order to do simple projects like this. So I have a drill press that I'm going to use to drill the hole into the blank, and you could use a standard drill. However, the hole is going to be a lot straighter if you use a clamp and a drill press configuration, but it's not necessary, but the results will be better. And this is the center finder that you use to find the center of the blank, a pen to mark. This is the correct size drill bit that we're going to use. The drill bit size is called out in the instructions for the kit. And then I got a piece of olive wood that I'll be making the keychain out of. It's got some really pretty grain in it. Olive wood's one of my favorite woods to work with on small projects like this. It's got a lot of character. And then some glue to hold the brass tube into the blank. This is a tube insertion tool. Helps get the tube in there. Again, not necessary. You can do this by hand, but you don't want to mess with this glue. It's really sticky and it sets extremely fast. I think this one sets in, was a 5-second set, so I like to use the tool because I don't want to get the stuff on my fingers, to avoid that. I got some 7mm bushings. Again, the bushings are called out in the instructions for the kit. And here's some basic chisels. This one's called a roughing gouge, and it's what we're going to use to go from the squared off blank down to a round. And then this one is a fingernail gouge, and it'll be a little bit finer. Use it for the more detailed work and maybe some designs or something. And then some sandpaper. Now this sandpaper is special sandpaper. You could get away with just using regular sandpaper, but I like this because it goes from extremely regular coarse to extremely fine. And then for safety, you're going to want a face shield, because when you're over here at the lathe and this thing's spinning, what do we got here? This 3,200 RPMs. If something chips, or the chisel catches something and chips, it can fly at your face, and you definitely want to be wearing that face shield. And then a grinding wheel that we will use to sharpen chisels. Not going to get into that today, but it's definitely a necessity, or at least some sort of whetstone in order to keep the chisels sharp, because they don't stay sharp for very long after continued use. Before we begin, I wanted to give you a nice close-up of the parts and pieces that came with the kit that we'll be making today. And it's a keychain kit, and this is the ring for the keys, and that goes through that hole. And then these are the two caps that will go over the wood, and they go in the tubes like that. These are what gets pressed in there. And of course, this will be wrapped in our olive wood when we're all done. So when you get your kit, one of the first things you want to consider is what blank you want to use for the kit. And blank refers to the piece of wood you're going to use to make your project out of. In this case, I happen to have an old cut-off piece of olive wood, and you can see the swirls on it. That's from a previous project, and I just found it in my cut-off bin. And one of the things you're looking for is that the length of the blank is just slightly longer than the tube that comes with the kit. Now this one is super close, but I think it'll still work just fine for this. And I really like the idea of using every bit of olive wood because it's expensive, but it's just so pretty. Something else to consider is the grain direction. You can tell that the grain's going in this direction, and that's what you want for strength. Because if the wood was inserted this way, it would work, but you would lose a lot of lines, and you wouldn't have as much character, and it wouldn't be as strong. Watch out for knots, because they'll weaken the wood, and the chisel could punch those out. So, but this one, it doesn't look like it goes all the way in, so we're good there. And And then the width, you want it to be wide enough that you're going to be able to get a pretty good sized round hunk out of there. Because once you get it to be round, you're going to want to put some details and, you know, some decorative marks in the wood, and you want to have space to do that. But the instructions in the manual that come with the kit will tell you a minimum size, and they give you an idea. So that's our blank. Oh, and one more note. Usually, this is the bushing. This is the minimum thickness that you're going to want from the finished product. And, you know, obviously, we've got plenty of room to work with. So this is good to go. Normally, the first step with preparing the blank would be to trim it to length. But since our blank is already the perfect size for our brass tube, we can go right ahead to finding center. Now I've got my center finding jig here, and you just rest it on a corner, and then you can see the mark, the line, and then turn it and mark another line, and you can go all the way around and you'll get a pattern showing where the center of the blank is. And even if it's not perfect, it still gives a pretty close idea, and you actually, with a blank this size, making a hole only that big, you could eye it, but I like to go by this. Now we've moved over to the drill press to begin drilling the hole. I've got the bit locked in, the clamp is clamped, blanks secure. Now something to keep in mind is this drill bit, when lowered all the way down to the maximum depth, will not cut all the way through the bit. So when I bottom out the bit, I'm going to turn off everything and raise the bed up about half an inch or so, and then continue drilling again in order to get all the way through. Another nice thing about the olive wood, you can tell is how good it smells from being cut. Alright, so we have the hole drilled all the way through. Good to go. And before we glue the tube into the hole, we want to rough it up a little bit to help give the glue something to adhere to. There's no science to this. You just kind of scratch it up with some regular coarse sandpaper, and that'll help a lot when the glue is put on. We're ready to make our glue up, and I have my gluing tool, and this just holds it like so, and then you insert it. Now the trick is to get it to float between the two ends, and you really only have one shot of this. They do make a tube extraction kit, however I do not have one. I've always just did my best to get it going or get it right in one shot, but things like that are available. Or you just turn the wood all the way down to the brass tube, or get a new tube, which they do sell by themselves. So here goes. Give it a little twist as you're putting it in. Help spread that glue around. All the way. I got a little gap of wood on this end and a little gap of wood on that end. See those two? You don't want the tube to be flush with the wood because we're going to trim that down. All you need is a little bit of space, and I think that'll be good. And then we're going to, it doesn't matter the glue on the outside, that'll get turned away. And I think that went well. And we'll give that a few minutes, even though it sets fast. I'm going to let that rest for a few minutes because the last thing I want is for it to fly apart when I'm spinning it. So here's a tool that I forgot to show in the beginning materials list. It's called a trimmer, and it's got cutting blades down here at the base as well as a cutting head. And what it's going to do, I'm going to put it into a drill, and it's going to go into the brass tube, and as it goes in, the first cutter is going to clean out the inside in case any glue got in there, and then once it goes all the way down, these cutters right here will trim the wood to be level with the ends of the brass tube. I'll also point out that some woodworkers out there prefer to use this on the drill press. I like to do it on this with a regular hand drill. However, if you are going to do it with a hand drill, be careful because you're holding it with your hand, and if it grabs it, it spins in your hand, and that's uncomfortable. So, here we go. And also note that the drill part is not coming out the other end. Just take it easy. Go. Doesn't have to be super fast. Just want to go slow. There it is. I heard it. Oh, no, it was just cut into the wood. A little bit more. This side won't be as much, it's a little shallower. Still, it's not sticking out the other end, so it won't catch the inside of my palm. There we go. For this piece, it's not absolutely critical that the ends are exactly lined up with the brass tube because this is just one piece. However, some pens, most pens, have a second chunk of wood that'll connect and they'll twist here. And at those points, you want to make sure that you're just trimming right to the brass tube and not actually cutting the brass tube itself. So what we have here is a lathe set up with a mandrel or a pen mandrel, and these are used to make pens and our keychain and other small kits on the lathe. These three bushings right here are spacers that will allow us to get a chisel in to the end of the project without hitting this, the end part. This final one here is kind of a guide that'll tell us how far to cut the wood down so it'll match the brass tube. So we can slide this on. Another black bushing. A couple of spacers. And then an end cap to hold it all in place. Now, you want it to be snug, but you don't want it to be super tight because it could possibly split the wood on maybe a larger piece. That's it, just enough. Okay, so everything's on the mandrel, but we're going to move the end here and loosen this up, move it forward. It's going to grab the mandrel. You can lock the back down, turn this back here, this bearing here. We'll move the whole head forward, lock it in, and then tighten it down. And now the lathe is ready. Almost. We still need a tool rest. This is a standard tool rest. It just gives you something to move the chisel back and forth on and help support the chisel as you're working. And you want it gets positioned in different places. The most important thing is it clears, and I like my chisel to be, let me see if you can see this, about halfway down the actual workpiece, so I can hold the chisel up into it like this and cut. And everything gets locked down. So the workpiece is mounted on the lathe, and the first thing you want to do before you start the lathe is spin it to make sure that the workpiece clears the chisel rest. And now, once we're good to go, the very first process is to use the roughing gouge to round out the workpiece. So here we go. At this point, you can start to decide how you want the profile of the piece to be, because now that we're actually round, we can start shaping it. Switch over to the fingernail gouge. And I think that'll about do it for carving it. I've left a little bit of room. I didn't carve straight down to the bearing or the bushing, because we need to leave room for sanding on both ends. But I'm happy with that shape. So the next step after getting the basic profile down is sanding, and I have these sanding discs that are the ones they go super fine all the way to 12,000 grit sandpaper, which is basically just feels like paper. So we don't have to go down to that point, but it's nice to have it. And I have a chart here that shows the order color coded. So here we go. And you just move it around. Light pressure. You don't have to push super hard, or it could burn. And just work your way through the grains. You can stop and get the sanding marks out like that, and then keep going. And you want to sand at lower RPMs, because it could burn the wood just like that. And if that happens, you just jump up to a coarser grit. Get rid of it. That'll do it for sanding. And that gave it a real nice smooth finish. The final step on the lathe is to put a little bit of Danish oil with a little bit of that glue that we used to put the tube in. That'll make it nice and sealed. Just a few drops. And you can crank up the RPM. Go back to the oil. A few more drops. One more time. And that'll give it a really nice lasting finish. Alright, here we are on the final step for the project. This is a press that's used to put together the pen parts, and you just put that cap in there. We'll do one at a time. Put that in there like that. Close the clamp, and then make sure it goes in as straight as possible. Here we go. That's the cap on that end. Flip it over. Do this end. You don't want to do both ends at the same time because it'll wobble and it could break. The whole thing could snap because the wood at the end is very thin, and it already gets a little wobbly with just one at a time. If you ever did decide to get into woodworking, this is a real good place to start. I'm going to head in there right now and grab some glue for our project today.